Folks, this all comes back to thoughts I had about actually how do we as individuals continue to take the fight on the CEE to the heart of those that can make a difference. And in my strong belief, that's those who sit in the Scottish Parliament. You're probably aware that Scotland does have quite a significant number of powers to do with emissions reductions. And they have been reasonably successful in meeting the targets. But recently, as with the UK government, there's a quite significant gap beginning to open up between targets and what they're beginning to achieve. This is the concept of the low-hanging fruit having been taken and the difficult, troublesome policies not having been put in place. So there's a degree of failure, I think, beginning to enter into what the Scottish Government is trying to do in terms of emissions reductions. And whilst we are great working together as a body, we do superb actions on the ground. I think individually, there's plenty of scope for us to take our own MSPs to task about governmental failures. Now, not everyone will agree about whether or not approaching MSPs actually will have a significant effect. Frankly, I've not too much time for that particular argument. I do think getting right to the heart of those that sit in government is important in terms of driving this struggle forward. And it may be, for instance, your MSP could be a minister who's got direct involvement in setting climate policy. I think the more of us in Scotland who do this, the better. There aren't that many MSPs. And if we can get a concerted number of us each lobbying our one constituency MSP and our 7 regional MSPs, we're going to hit a lot of people in the Scottish Parliament. So, in my view, I think this gets right to the heart of that singular legislative body in Scotland that can do something about this crisis that we're now in. I also think that there's an awful lot of ignorance out there. I think our MSPs are not well briefed, and certainly my experience so far of talking to them is that they're really actually rather ignorant about the climate and ecological emergency. So this sort of engagement, and I sat for 30 minutes with my MSP and talked it through, I think is a valuable tool to educate individual MSPs about what is going on. Getting ready for it also taught me a lot about where the Scottish Government is in all of this, and we'll touch on this as we go through the presentation. ScotGov has actually got quite a few delegated powers to it, more than I thought. Quite often we've heard Nicola in particular hide behind Boris Johnson's coattails saying that's all the UK government business. Well, no, there's an awful lot that's Scottish government business here. So this is very useful in finding out what ScotGov can actually do. And I also found it very good training to engage with an educated individual who's willing to talk, who's willing to have a discussion, who may have a different view. It's very good training, I find, in terms of trying to engage those outside our bubble, those who perhaps don't share the same views, but are willing to talk. So, super training. So, those really are, I think, the pros of why this is well worth considering. Right, how did I do it? Pretty straightforward stuff. Firstly, identify who your MSP is. We've all got one constituency and 7 regional MSPs. And the ScotGov website is very good. It makes it very easy to find out who your MSPs are. Let's see if we can just make this work now. We click into the link. Find MSPs by postcode. Here's my postcode. We'll search, and there we are. And there's Christine, in my case, MSP for Midlothian, and they're all of my regional MSPs for South Scotland. So they're all on my target list. So very straightforward to find out who these guys are. Having found out, a simple email should get you that meeting. That's all I did, and here's the text that I used. Your MSP, your constituency MSP, is your representative. As far as I know, they can't refuse to meet you. It doesn't have to be in person. I did it online, but I did have 30 minutes of Christine's time in the end online. It was a super discussion. So with your details, with your email, you should be able to set up that meeting relatively straightforwardly. Of course, it takes time to find some time in their diary, but work with a secretary. It's not a difficult process, I found. Preparing for the meeting, I think, is important. You're going to have potentially 15, potentially 30 minutes with someone who could be reasonably well educated, or perhaps someone who isn't well educated, who has different views and will take persuading to come on board with some of what we have to say. So I think understanding your topic is important. You saw from my email text, I've been majoring on the Climate Change Committee's report on how Scotland is doing in terms of emissions reductions. In December of last year, the CCC, led by Chris Stark, delivered a very, very strong report about Scotland's emissions reductions progress. It was, in a word, damning. And the CCC has produced an excellent summary of that. We've got the links in this presentation, and they've also produced an excellent video. And I spent some considerable time reading that, listening to the video, picking out the issues I wanted to discuss, and that really gave me the background I needed to step into this meeting. I have done other work in this area. I've done a lot of work on heat and buildings. I looked at the just transition strategy as well. You may have looked at other things in your own time, but I would thoroughly recommend the CCC's latest report on ScotGov's progress. It's a fascinating insight into where ScotGov is going, has gone, where it's failing, where it's making progress. And most powerfully, it is extremely damning. We'll have a quick look at some of Chris Stark's comments in the video, but that really does give you the ammunition to have a very powerful discussion with your MSP along the lines of, well, this is what you're doing. And the independent arbiter, your independent advisor, is taking you hugely to task. Now, something is going badly wrong here. What are we going to do about it? That's the substance, in my view, of why that DEC report, sorry, the CCC report is so useful in terms of setting up this meeting. I prepared a crib sheet with notes. I had some opening questions. I had the main points I wanted to deliver and a closing request, all sketched out in a piece of paper in front of me. You'll prepare differently for meetings perhaps, but I found having all of that actually sorted my thinking out in my own head, and I had my notes to refer to as we got more and more into the detail. The meeting itself then. I started with some opening questions. Now, you might find that slightly odd. Sorry, Carol?
Sorry, nothing.
Yeah, you might find that a slightly odd way to open up a meeting. I wasn't trying to undermine my MSP. What I was trying to do by asking a few opening questions was perhaps just make clear she doesn't know very much at all about the fundamentals of the climate crisis. I wanted to get that point across because really my aim was all about the level of understanding in the Scottish Parliament about the climate crisis and how we need to improve it. So I thought I'd start with her, and I gave her these opening questions to see where she thought she was in understanding the climate crisis. And lo and behold, she hadn't a clue, quite frankly. It's not an area she'd done much thinking in, and hopefully she's doing a lot more as a consequence. But simply having these few facts, a few questions fired at her, A, highlighted some of the important points about how critical this crisis has got, and B, made clear to her that actually these are things she probably should be aware of, but wasn't. And I do find it frightening that that legislative body, that one machine which can do something about this crisis that we're in, is populated by people whose level of understanding is really very low. So those are my opening questions. We then went on to have a quite rounded discussion about where the CCC's report left us. And it's not difficult to pick some excellent comments out from Chris Stark's comments, from the report itself. It is a litany of failure. You're not, of course, trying to drive this down your MSP's throat as their fault. What you're trying to do, I think, is simply make clear that after the Climate Change Act in Scotland came in 2009, so we've been at this now for, what, 14 years with that act in place. After 14 years, we are really a long way away from where we should be. And given the background of information on the climate crisis, I think most understand that 2030 is quite a pivotal point in this whole process. They generally understand that significant reductions need to be made by then. So I think you'll find a broad awareness that things are getting harder and harder and more urgent. But to have some of the specifics pointed out, I thought was very powerful. And you will find all of these, if you choose to use it, set out very clearly in the CCC's report from December of last year. And it does make for some shocking reading. I think at this stage, we might actually try and listen to some of what Chris Stark has said. So let's see if we can do that.
Scotland reached that kind of landmark 50% reduction. And I think
there's not much to say here, but hopefully you can hear what he's saying.
More and more the wider benefits of net zero, which go way beyond climate. Every year we look at it, we understand that more and more. But I'm afraid it is a hollow celebration because it's a pandemic effect. It was the curtailment of Scotland's travel over the pandemic that brought us to that magic 50. All the signs are, sadly, that it is a temporary fall. And that brings us to what happens next, I suppose. And just to make the point, for those of you who followed some of the coverage today of the report in the news, it's quite right to say that this is the strongest criticism that we've ever offered to the Scottish Government. We have done that deliberately. Why have we done that? Well, it's because we think we are running out of time. Just as John said at the top of our call this morning, it's because we are not sure that Scottish ministers are really hearing the messages that we have been passing to them pretty consistently now over recent years. We may well have gone halfway to net zero in this year's data, but we are certainly not confident at all that Scotland is on track to make the kind of systemic shifts that would be necessary for the next half. We do see some new welcome policies. There is new policy there. The programme for government each year does contain climate policies, which are always welcome, of course, but bluntly, it's just not nearly enough. It's not at that kind of scale that we would need to see to believe that Scotland would be on track. So I worry that we are now seeing the collective impacts of what you might call magical thinking in the Scottish Government. We have published ambitions from Scottish ministers to reduce emissions in every sector of the Scottish economy. Those haven't been updated for a couple of years. We don't really have any sense now of how policy is going to meet those kind of ambitions. We are promised new pathways next year. But you could put it another way, the Scottish climate strategy at the moment does appear to live in a model rather than in the real world. So we wanted to shine a light on that. And let me just give you one further chart this morning. We like a chart in the CCC. So an example perhaps of that magical thinking. Just to go back to that 20% car kilometre reduction target, which would be game-changing if Scotland could achieve it. Really genuinely transformative target for a host of reasons, not just for climate. Here, what we've done is convert that 20% target to the annual reduction that would be required in car kilometres, about 3% each year. And showing you that against some evidence from past experience of policies and approaches and modelling to get to a reduction in car demand. Just to be clear, Scottish car miles are currently growing. So we would need to match, to achieve that 20% car kilometre reduction target, we'd need to match the best ever year for demand reduction in Scotland. That is a year where we had the recession impacts after the financial crisis. We'd need to beat the impacts of London's congestion charge, one of the most controversial and well thought through policies in transport of the last 20 or 30 years. And we'd need to do that in Scotland consistently for the rest of this decade. Now,
Powerful words, in my view. I would hope you would agree. And there's a lot more of that, which is why I do say that is a very well worth while video to study. There's an awful lot of red meat in there that will give you all you need to have a fantastic discussion with your MSP and make clear how far adrift Scottish Government now is. There are some of the points on the screen that we talked about, all referred to in more detail in the CC's report. Use as you wish. How do you close this off? This was actually difficult, I found. Where does the meeting take you? And frankly, the conclusion of mine with Christine Graham wasn't particularly satisfactory, other than the fact that we had a good 30-minute discussion. I think she went away understanding how little she knew about this very important problem. I essentially said, look, I believe that knowledge in Scottish Parliament is way too low on this subject. It needs to be better. So how can we improve the Parliament's collective knowledge of the crisis? Simply to drive faster and better policy. Could we, for instance, have a briefing by some respected independent academic on the topic who can collectively bring the level of understanding up to where it needs to be? So I posed those questions. I have to say I didn't make much headway with her. I think she was feeling somewhat overwhelmed at this point, which is fair enough. It was our first engagement. But all in all, it was a solid 30 minutes worth of discussion where I really do think she got the point about where we are and how little she knew. I'm now in the process of continuing that process with my regional MSPs. And I think that's where each of us needs to go, having ticked off our constituency, then on to the regionals. If each of us do that, we're going to tick off 8 MSPs in this fashion. And hopefully that's going to at least drive some positive progress when Scottish Government comes to reconsider its policies, which it's going to have to do in the second half of this year. It's going to republish its climate change plan later this year or early next. And in the light of what the CCC has said, that damning criticism, we're expecting, hopefully, much better policies to drive change. So that's really all I've got to say on what I did. I hope that's useful. I'll share these slides in the chat. But really now at this point, I think it's over to you for questions. Yeah, Craig.
Yes, so I think you mentioned it before, but just to repeat, you targeted your constituency MSP first, and then after that it should be regional, yeah? Yep. Okay.
I'm not sure there's any particular logic to that, but you know, it sounds right to start with your constituency MSP and then move from there.
Are there do you think there are any MSPs who get it?
It's a good question. I suspect there are very few, and those very few are the ones that focus in the right committee. Carrie, your sound is really breaking up quite badly.
Yeah, but I think you were going to ask the same question.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah. We can hear you now.
I'm just going to say that Lorna Slater is one of my MSPs.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, well, fantastic. Then you can get right to the heart of the matter. She is a minister, I understand. She does have responsibility for elements of this programme, and she has presided whilst this litany of failure has developed. What a perfect target. Love to hear how you get on with her.
She's my MSP as well.
So, now, if two of you...
And mine as well.
Three-pronged attack.
A three-pronged attack would be outstanding. Now, she may well, of course, say a lot in her defence, but I have to say, you line Chris Stark's comments up against her, and she's in deep trouble. So it'll be fascinating to hear how you get on with her.
An intimidating opponent, no? She'll probably know more than me about these matters.
Well, maybe she might, but I think all you need to do is fall back on what the CCC has said, and it is simple, straightforward, and damning. And maybe you got a feel for it from Chris Stark's comments there. He is equally damning. You don't hear many public or quasi non-governmental bodies talk in such stark terms, every pun intended given his surname, but he does talk in very stark terms. His criticism is not held back at all. He shoots from the hip, and it's really powerful stuff. And you may know he's done the same with the UK government in the last week. They've just done the same process for UK government as they did for Scottish government at the end of last year. Sarah, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, thanks, Max. That's really, really helpful and really interesting as well. I wondered about how much risk there was of pissing the person off. That's not very clearly expressed, but of stopping them listening by asking them questions right at the beginning to demonstrate their ignorance. You know, to what extent will it put them on the defensive and make them a little bit less receptive to what you've got to say? So that was the question. And then I've got another comment.
No, it's a fair point. It was a slightly high risk strategy, which is why I tried to emphasize too, and I said this, that I'm not trying to belittle her or make her feel ignorant, but I said, look, there are several critical factors in the climate crisis I think everybody who's involved in resolving it should know. And here they are. Do you know the answer? Put it that way. So it is, I think, about how you put it. And if you feel uncomfortable, if you think it'd be counterproductive, then choose a different tack. You know, the CCC report offers you so many ways, and you could perhaps drop those if you don't feel comfortable trying that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. And then the other thing was...
So on you go.
Was just to suggest that was just to suggest that before, it's good to see if your MSP or any of your MSPs are on any committees. So that's another just wee thing to do before, when you're preparing for it. See, are they members of any committees? Because often you can take an angle that's relevant to the committee they're on, if they are, because there'll be something relevant to almost every committee in that report, and that's related to the climate emergency. Almost every single committee will have something of interest that's relevant. It won't just be the committee that's dealing with whatever it is, transport, net zero. I can't remember the name of the specific committee now, but
Mine
net zero energy and transport.
Yeah, Christine Graham had gardening as one of her portfolio interests. So there was an angle there we talked briefly about. David, I think next, and then Carol.
Right. As well as quoting Chris Stark, you could there are also some quotes you could use from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Yep.
I like Chris because he is so pointed on the Scottish government's failings, and obviously Guterres, who now talks like one of us, and more of that in September of this year, is talking globally. But yeah, he does talk very powerfully now. Carol.
What I was going to say was, I think Lorna Slater's probably fairly well clued up, but the constituency MP, Ben McPherson, hasn't got much of a clue. I've been to see him and I ended up ranting a bit because he knew so little. Poor guy. But no, he just said, oh, the SNP is doing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you know, we're all on track. That when I've written to him, it's always exactly the same. You know, we're doing fine. But there's no sense of urgency, and I was trying to get this over to him, but I wasn't succeeding very well. This was a few years ago, mind you, pre-pandemic.
Well, that's where the CCC's work is so useful.
Yes.
Many would criticise the CCC as not being clear enough about the urgency. They don't, for instance, look at equity in any of their calculations. So many would say they're not tough enough on the government. That said, you're not going to find a tougher report on government work than the one that they have delivered in December and then again in June for UK government. So I think this is what's so useful about these reports and about the videos. They are bang up to date, and they leave no room for wriggling, no room for complacency, no room for saying we're doing a good job. They clearly demonstrate the gap between what they've done and what they need to be doing. It's so powerful, it's so clear. That's why I think now's a good time to be doing it, because we have this body doing such a good job in terms of demonstrating that attainment gap. Good. Some written questions. How do you find what committee they're on? My MSP is Ash Regan. It's a good question. A ScotGov website, I think, does list who's on what committee. And then on the flip side of that, I think your bios for your MSPs will also tell you what committees they are on. So ScotGov's website, I have found a very good resource for finding that sort of information.
I think I found it now. It's the same website you linked before to find your MSP.
Yeah.
If you click on their bio,
really very useful. Back to Carol.
So I just wonder, are they all going off on vacation now, or
recess? I think
now. Recess. So when's a good time to do this?
I would say now. They don't stop working. Now's probably a reasonable time because they're not pressed with parliamentary business. They may have more time for constituents. So I wouldn't stop just because they're in recess. It doesn't mean they're off on holidays. They may be on holidays, but and they're back on the 3rd or 4th of September, or at least so Parliament will reopen.
One could set up a meeting now for later on, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah. It'll take several days or weeks to get that meeting in the eye in the first place.
Yep. Thank you.
Folks, any more? Sarah.
It was just to say that you can also see on the Parliament website, if you found out they're on a committee, you can look up what the committee business is and see what the committee is going to be discussing and their latest reports and so on. So if you wanted to do any more research, just particularly around your particular MSP and find out a bit more about what's going on with them and what their committee is discussing, that's fairly easy to find on the Parliament website.
Jan.
Yeah, I was just wondering, since 3 of us have got the same MSP, is it more powerful for us to go individually, or would it be better if we did a concerted triumvirate attack?
To terrify him.
I would think individually. You are each a constituent. You have your own right to speak with your own voice. The fact that Lorna gets hit 3 times, in my view, has power. It means people really are out there and really concerned about this. If you go in at once, then perhaps that dilutes what could be 3 strong voices. That's my view anyway.
Yeah, no, I think it would probably be easier to do it alone as well, because it saves having to get together and prepare it together. You can work on your own and
absolutely
just go for what suits you and dates that suit you as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Good, folks. I sense there's some keenness to have a go. Here's Sarah again.
Do you think it's worth asking them about a citizens' assembly, or do you think the fact that Scotland's kind of experimented with citizens' assemblies and hasn't done very much with them makes that a little bit of a pointless request?
I'm afraid so. I think if you didn't know, the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 embodied the need for citizens' assemblies back in 2009. This is not an XR invention by any means, but they fell markedly short. And I do recall one of our group, Justin in XR Edinburgh, actually found himself standing on top of the Scottish Parliament roof in protest at how poorly the assemblies were run at the time, and he was arrested and has just been through the court process. So I'm afraid I think those are a little bit of a red herring. I think the powerful critique that the CCC delivers, the objective failings they highlight are, I think, give you the power. Folks, super. Oh yeah, Sarah.
Sorry, I think it would be really great if people do this and go and speak to their MSPs, for us to get back together and discuss how it's gone. You know, it'd be really good to hear
Feedback.
back from people, yeah, and see what worked, what didn't work, whether you got any traction, what subjects, you know, what topics were most effective, and how people responded. You know, it would be really helpful, I think, to everybody, and to see how we can learn from it, maybe to build.
Completely agree. Completely agree. So perhaps then, as you make your approaches and have your meetings, you could then tell us, and we can arrange meetings then to pick up the feedback. That would be really good.